Welcome, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm very pleased to have so many of you with us here today for this. Today, I think it's our 43rd or 44th episode of This Is CDR. This Is CDR is an online event series presented by OpenAir to explore the range of carbon removal solutions currently being researched, developed, and deployed, and to contextualize them for carbon removal policy that OpenAir is working on advancing in New York State and other US states, localities, and jurisdictions worldwide. Everyone, please, if you haven't already, please introduce yourself in the chat and tell us where you're zooming in from. My name is Toby Bryce. I'm in Brooklyn, New York, and I work on CDR policy advocacy and market development for OpenAir. Just some quick background on OpenAir. We are a distributed volunteer network dedicated to the advancement of CDR solutions essential to solving the climate crisis. Global community growing pretty quickly, and we collaborate on shared open missions in the areas of policy advocacy, R&D, and activist CDR market development. Should be a link in the chat to a forum where you can sign up to join our group, and we'd love to have you. Plenty of work to do, and we need all hands on deck. Things before we get started with our program that we always like to do. Number one, it's really important to define what we mean and what we say carbon removal. This definition is from a document called the CDR Primer, and it's essentially the same definition that's in the IPCC AR6 report. But carbon removal is purposeful human activity to remove CO2 from the atmosphere and to durably store it in geological, terrestrial, or ocean reservoirs or in long-lived products. It's really important to disambiguate carbon removal with what is commonly called carbon capture, which typically means capturing CO2 from an emission source, a point source, whether it's a cement factory or a natural gas power plant. That's a potentially useful climate solution, but it's a form of emissions reduction, and it's not carbon removal. Carbon removal, again, is removing CO2 from the atmosphere and then durably storing it underground, in the ocean, or in long-lived products. The other really important thing to talk about when you talk about carbon removal is that it is in no way, shape, or form any sort of substitute for reducing emissions. It's really a global imperative that we reduce our emissions and decarbonize our economy as quickly and as completely as possible, full stop. That said, there are going to be emission sources that we're not going to be able to eliminate in a climate relevant time frame because they're either hard or inequitable to abate. And for that reason, in the near term, we're going to need carbon removal to balance those out. There's clear scientific consensus that this is going to be required at gigaton scale. That's billions of tons a year by mid-century. We're currently at kiloton scale, so we have a tremendous amount of work to do to scale this necessary climate solution. In the second half of the century, carbon removal is going to be required once we do get to net zero, and it's going to be required to remove the tremendous excess of carbon dioxide we already have in the atmosphere to restore our climate to a safer and healthier state, which, as we can see from the daily news reports, we're not currently at a safe or healthy state, and it's going to get worse before it gets better. So really important to understand those things, and we always like to call them out up front. We'll be putting some resources in the chat if you want to learn more about CDR. Again, the carbon dioxide removal primer is a great place to start. This series, also 40 plus episodes now, is another great place to learn. And we're going to learn more today about a really interesting carbon removal method. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Megha Raghavan, and she's going to introduce today's session and talk a little bit about the run of show.
Hey everyone, I'm Megha. I'm an OpenAir member based in London. So just quick housekeeping notes as usual. So we'll start with a quick presentation followed by a few prepared questions from Toby and then moderated audience Q&A. So if you have any questions, just put them in the Q&A box in Zoom. That's going to be separate from the chat box, so make sure you find the right one to help us organize them better. The event's also being recorded, so we'll send the video link out to everyone who registered, and we'll also post it to OpenAir's website and YouTube channel. All right, so this week on This Is CDR, we're very pleased to welcome Carbon Drawdown Initiative founder and CEO Dirk Paessler and geologist Ingrid Smet to tell us about Project Carbdown, a long-term enhanced rock weathering or ERW field trial with a focus on the project's efforts to develop effective and practical measurement, reporting, and verification, or MRV, of ERW as a method of durable carbon removal. So about Dirk, after founding and running the internet and software companies for 30 years, Dirk Paessler turned his attention to climate solutions in 2020. And with Carbon Drawdown Initiative, he works on speeding up negative emissions together with CTO Ralf Steffens. They currently focus on enhanced rock weathering on croplands as one of the few CDR solutions that can be scaled up to climate relevancy in the next 2 to 3 decades. Geologist Ingrid Smet obtained a PhD for her geochemical research into Greek volcanoes, after which she explored active volcanoes worldwide as a tour organizer. Her research focus shifted to climate change mitigation when in late 2020, she was hired by FSM software company Fieldcode to set up their CO2 removal projects. She carries out multiple enhanced weathering field trials in Greece, combining existing agriculture with locally found olivine-rich rocks in collaboration with Project Carbdown. So both of you, whenever you're ready, over to you.
Okay, let me share my screen. Welcome. Thank you very much for giving me the chance to talk about enhanced rock weathering and why we think ERW is ready to scale, and it could be scaled up faster than you may think. Just a short word about me. I'm the CEO and founder of Carbon Drawdown Initiative. Our mission is to speed up negative emissions, and together with my colleague Ralf Steffens, we are running the science effort Project Carbdown. We are early investors of Climeworks, 44.1, Carbon Future, This Is Carbon, Project Vesta, and a couple of other smaller projects. We are co-founders of Negative Emissions Platform, which is a lobby organization in Brussels. And all this is happening because it's independently funded by our family foundation. As Toby just mentioned, there is a problem. Decarbonization of our lives in a few decades is a huge challenge for humanity, maybe the biggest challenge right now. Without 90% emission reductions, all carbon dioxide removal, CDR, is pointless. If you are pro-CDR, you must be a passionate advocate of mitigation first. But emission reductions is not what I will talk today. Decarbonization will not lead to net zero. Toby also mentioned that already. Warming will not be stopped by it. We will need to pull CO2 from the air to reach net zero and lower CO2 levels in the long term. So the oil rig in this picture that I took on the North Sea, we don't not only have to stop working like that, we need to reverse the direction in which materials flows through this. To give us a sense of scale, the IPCC calls for 5 to 10 gigatons of CO2 emissions, negative emissions by 2050. That's effectively a new industry in the same order of magnitude as the current global oil industry. Let's assume we'll try to do 30%, so 3 gigatons of that with enhanced weathering. This will require somewhere in the range of 9 to 11 gigatons per year of basalt. This equals the mass of 1,500 Cheops pyramids in Egypt globally every year. Well, that's, at first glance, you would think, well, that's not possible. But if you realize that humans move 300 gigatons of rock, sand, oil, and other stuff every year, that's even 30 times more today. So I think we do have a chance to scale this up. But scaling takes time. We are very late. We should have started many of the science efforts 20 to 30 years ago. But now we'll need to grow the CDR industry by 40 to 50% per year for 30 years to get scale. That's even faster than we scaled up solar and wind over the last 40 years. Scaling needs compound growth, and the later we start, the faster we need to scale, the harder the job is. And this is a huge challenge for all of us. It comes with huge opportunities for individuals. Like if you're a young person, please come to carbon dioxide removal industry and pick up a career. For scientists, for investors, for entrepreneurs. Let's do something. There's a lot to be gained from this. From our perspective, we think 3 options can be scaled fast enough that we can look at right now. Direct air capture is one of them, and it's probably the one that has the highest potential in the long run. Pyrolysis, meaning biochar, bio-oil, there are already 100,000 tons of CO2 CDR in Europe right now. So this is the only number that actually has at least a few zeros in it. And then we have an enhanced rock weathering. I think from our perspective, the intentional CDR amount per year is somewhere in the few thousand tons right now. I want to show you that we should be able to scale up enhanced weathering, as you can see on the curves on the right, we should be able to scale up enhanced weathering maybe faster than the other two. In the long term, direct air capture will win, but we do have a chance with enhanced rock weathering. So here you can see natural rock weathering. So this is a rock in Iceland that I photographed a few years ago, and that is standing there probably for 1 million years. And water and frost and CO2 have already done a lot there. You can see that the whole rock is crumbling down over time. So the rocks make a chemical reaction with water and CO2, and this is a slow weathering reaction, unfortunately. As I said, 1 million years just to get this. But in the end, we are creating a permanent carbon storage. This is how Earth has been collecting CO2 from the air for billions of years. I'm making it a little simple here, but this is effectively what's going on. How can we make this faster? Let's take the basalt, mine it, grind it up, put it on a truck, drive it to a farmer who spreads it on his field. Let's monitor what's going on in the field, then we can certify and sell negative emissions. And the point is, this is a self-driving, almost irreversible process. We speed it up by grinding the rock for a large surface, and we put it in a favorable place. Biologically active soils have 5 to 20 times higher CO2 concentrations than the ambient air, so the rock doesn't have to look long to find the next CO2 molecule. And there are other helpers in the soil also. Fungi, bacteria, even worms are helping to speed up the weathering process. As a rough estimate, you can say that every ton of basalt captures 0.3 tons of CO2, some more, some less, but this is something that you can use as a rule of thumb. The global supply of basalt is more than enough, at least more than we can that we can grind and put on fields. And if you do a life cycle assessment of the whole process, it is clearly climate positive. Due to the simplicity of the process, you just put rocks on a field and that's more or less it. Due to the low tech and low capital requirements, enhanced rock weathering could be the fastest growing and cheapest CDR method over the next 10 years. That's what I believe. Just imagine there's even already a working supply chain for hundreds of thousands of tons of basalt per year, including waste rocks. There are basalt companies all over the planet, and basalt is used in a lot of other things. And we can just use that supply chain. We just have to redirect it to the fields. This ramp up will be possible without developing new technology, because all the machinery involved, we already have that technology. Most of the new machinery, at least for the next, I don't know, 4 or 5 years, that's already available. You can just rent the truck, you can just rent the spreader, it's already built. And we do not have to spend money for land and energy. There's a supply shortage of the CDR market, which is currently going on. This will be likely sustained for years, and that will keep the prices up. So this is a huge opportunity for all of us. Of course, all carbon dioxide removal methods must provide rigorous monitoring, reporting, and verification, called MRV. For enhanced rock weathering, the MRV and certification methods are being developed right now. We are part of that. But not having a perfect MRV yet is no reason to delay the scale-up. We know it works. Just make sure you follow some basic rules, and I'll introduce our cheat sheet for that later. Let's do a thought experiment. If you go to one of the DAC companies today and you buy 1 ton of carbon dioxide removal, that will cost you somewhere between 600 and 800 euros per ton. And it will take them, let's say, 5 to 7 years to suck the CO2 out of the air, because they first have to engineer the machine, and then they have to run them, then they have to build the machine, and then they have to run the machine. If you take the same 800 euros, you could buy maybe up to 30 tons of basalt in the EU today, and you could spread that on fields, and it will capture maybe up to 10 tons of CO2 over the next 10 to 30 years. That's what we know already. And almost certainly more than 1 ton in the first 7 years. So after 7 years, you actually have to make more progress than buying the carbon dioxide remover from the duck company. I'm not trying to bash the duck companies here. It's just a matter of understanding how this works. They are doing great work and we need them, just to make sure that I'm not mistaken here. By buying or selling enhanced rock weathering certificates today, you would enable a direly needed scale-up. Let's have a short deep dive into why measuring enhanced rock weathering is really hard. So here we have 1 square meter of soil, 1 cubic meter of soil, maybe 2,000 kilograms, depending on the stuff. Annually, depending on where you are, you have maybe between 500 and 1,500 liters of annual precipitation, maybe plus irrigation. And about half of that goes back into the atmosphere by evaporation and through the plants. And the rest is percolating water that goes into the groundwater, goes into the next river, and then finally ends up in the ocean. And over 1 year, you have a carbon cycle of plants that will actually obscure anything that you are trying to measure regarding carbon here. So now let's 4 kilograms of basalt dust, which is the equivalent to 40 tons of basalt for a hectare, which is the usual amount that we work with. This will collect about 120 grams of CO2 per year on this square meter or this cubic meter. And the 120 grams of CO2 will come out with the percolating water as a few hundred grams of alkalinity and carbonates per year. But this is mixed into 800 liters of the water. That's hard. So there are actually 3 ways I could think of how we can measure how much CO2 we are actually collecting. You're either finding a way to do a full 360 carbon flux analysis for this cubic meter of soil, which is pretty hard because if you put this whole thing in a box, then you're not in open nature anymore and you break everything. The second approach is taking soil samples every few months and look for the remaining basalt grains, which is, again, quite hard because we mixed 4 kilograms of superfine dust into 2,000 kilograms of soil, and we're trying to find these grains again and want to find out how much the amount of basalt that still remains in the soil has changed. And the third option is to take water samples over a year, do lab analysis, and look for the reaction products down here. So I do not know about anybody who's trying to go to do option 1, except if you are trying to do some lab experiments, but then quite likely you won't have much nature in that, and that's a dead soil experiment. These experiments are important, and for example, Professor Jens Hartmann in Hamburg is doing soil experiments, but he only has a lab atmosphere, a lab environment, and there are no worms, there are very few bacteria, and at least no plants. So option 2 is something that Lithos Carbon is doing, a company that we are involved with. When we add basalt dust to a field, we are adding alien elements and isotopes to the soil. If we now find out the changes of the mixtures of these elements and isotopes over time, it is possible to track the dissolution of the basalt. And from the basalt dissolution, we can derive the amount of sequestered CO2. Lithos has developed such a measurement system along with an extensive soil and weathering model. And option 3 is what we do at Project Carbdown. We are about 20 scientists, more than 20 scientists from a number of universities, and we are working together for 2 years now. And we are doing these soil experiments, like from Professor Hartmann I mentioned. We are having greenhouse experiments. We are digging lysimeters into the soil. We are running flux meters in Wageningen. We've built 20 large lysimeters that we put into the ground to measure stuff. And we are doing electronic sensors, as you can see over here. We are looking at the weathering reaction products in the drainage water. As I told you, a few hundred grams mixed into a few hundred liters of water every year. And we are looking for metrics like total alkalinity, pH, and electrical conductivity the ion balance, isotopes, and stuff, using extensive lab data and hundreds of electronic in situ sensors. This, for example, is the current dashboard of our XXL lysimeter experiment. Each of the colored lines here is the data from one of these lysimeters. And you can see, we can see how high the water in the tank is, what the electrical conductivity at 30 and 60 centimeter is, or the pH in various depth. I think the special thing about Project Carbdown is that all our experiments that we run on fields and labs and in greenhouses, they are synchronized. We are using the same rocks, the same soils, the same rates. So we're actually trucking around tons of rocks and soils through Europe to do this. Let's talk about a few of the results that we have. We are still collecting water since March 2021 and data, and it looks like we will do this for the foreseeable future. We haven't put out any peer-reviewed papers yet, but from what I can tell, what we have seen in the data and what we can understand right now, we currently assume that 1 ton of basalt actually can draw down 1/3 of a ton of CO2 over time, and that 1 ton of basalt will remove most of this potential in less than 5 to 30 years. If it's placed on biologically active cropland or greenland or something where you have biological activity and a higher CO2 level in the soil. And if the parameters in our cheat sheet, which I will show in a minute, are met in either the neutral or the beta columns. Further investigations and all the results that we will publish as soon as they are available. In a climate relevant timescale, think of that, 5 to 30 years. This is very short in a climate relevant timescale. So we already know enough to start spreading lots of basalt right now. And we should do this because the scaling up of these spreading processes will take time. So you will find this cheat sheet on our webpage, on our blog, and we'll update it whenever we get any further. So we have looked at a couple of parameters like rainfall, temperature, soil type, and rock type, and we've together with our scientists, we've sorted out the good and the bad ones. Try to stay away from projects that are somewhere in this region, right? Really bad or bad, because there might be a chance that you're actually putting out more CO2 in the atmosphere than instead of removing stuff. The logical next step is a formal certification method, of course. We are working together with the Ithaca Institute. They have put out a certification methodology for biochar, which is called the European Biochar Certificate, CSync, and that was 2020. And we're using that as a blueprint, and we are developing a certificate methodology for enhanced weathering. And we are trying we are currently setting up a full value chain demonstration from the mine, from the basalt, all the way to the certificate that's going to be sold on Carbon Future in the late 2020. And this will involve about 1,000 tons of rock powder. We've done a smaller pilot project this spring. So here you can see a truck delivering 27 tons of Eiffel Gold basalt. And we put that on a field here in Fürth. And that will sequester 10 tons of CO2 per hectare over the next 5 to 30 years. And that has already been included, that we did do some emissions, which are in the order of 15% of the total CO2 collection. Including a decent payment to the farmer, our price was 303 euros per ton of CO2. But please remember, this whole experiment was in the EU. It is based on standard basalt. We just ordered by list price. We did not negotiate anything here. We just tried what happens if we do it straightforward. And we did not do any optimizations. One of them would be our field currently is 350 kilometers away from the mine. And so the transport CO2 was the biggest single emission that we had. If we think of optimizing all this whole process, like going closer to the mine, using cheap waste basalts, which are abundant in most of these mines, I think we should be able to reach a EU-based price below 100 euro per ton of CO2, maybe that's possible. We found a few practicalities over the time. So the first ton of basalt we actually spread by hand over here on our field. We tried to put basalt into manure and distribute it with manure, which we tried to use big bags and spread that on our field. Actually, driving around with that wheel loader was a lot of fun, but it was completely clear this won't scale anywhere. So we have to do the bulk thing. First of all, the farmers won't accept lots of extra work or even manual work. They also don't want to buy additional equipment we need to do with the existing stuff. In order to spread basalt at scale, which in our view is 40 tons per hectare or something, you either need some stuff that has grains above 1,000 microns, so the lime spreader can be used, which you can see here down here. So in this occasion, we had rain on the pile of basalt before, and that's the reason why it's not dusty. So this was a quite dry pile, and that was more dusty. And only actually bulk equipment will work. Big bags won't scale. Just imagine having a field of 1 hectare and you put 40 big bags on the side of it, and then you ask somebody to distribute that. You might think that smaller grain sizes are mostly better, yes, but we found in our material that the coarser material, which was easier to spread, which did not stick together when it got wet and stuff, that actually had a larger surface area in our measurements, almost 40% more than our fine dust. And more surface area equals more reactivity. So as we would expect a faster weathering. What we do not know, and what nobody I have asked could tell me, will this rougher surface, or will this be flattened or increased by weathering over time? Will the reactivity slow down, remain the same, or speed up over time? Could this trend be influenced up or down somehow? If you know, please let me know. Otherwise, we will do some experiments to find out. And then we haven't even talked about the co-benefits for the farmer. Applying basalt dust on fields often increases crop yields, makes plants more healthy, and improves several other parameters. These improvements will benefit the farmer additionally to his share of the CDR certification price, for example, by having just a better crop yield, more money from his crop. Our pilot projects already work economically for all the involved parties without even factoring in these co-benefits. They come on top. And as soon as we have more understanding on how all this works, this will surely be a part of the whole economic calculation behind this. A good starting point would be to replace lime with basalt. In Germany, just in Germany alone, we have 1 million tons per year of CO2 emissions just because of liming. But basalt does more or less the same. So we would avoid the 1 million tons of CO2 emissions from the lime, and we would even add the climate positive features of the basalt that collects CO2 from the air. There are a couple of questions that have to be answered. How much basalt for how much lime, in what circumstances? Again, there are a lot of questions still open. Field experiments are needed, but I think the message is clear. Let's replace lime with basalt. So this is my last slide. Let's recap. The future of soil direct air capture, or enhanced rock weathering, if you will, we need to realize that the CDR is much more a mass problem than a science problem. Not the science is the big problem, scaling is, but by at least an order of magnitude harder, I would say in an easy way. Don't wait for just another study. Enhanced rock weathering is working and it's ready to scale. Enhanced rock weathering's simplicity and the fact that we do not need to build new machinery, and that there is a plenty of rock supply, including cheap waste rocks, could make enhanced rock weathering the fastest growing CDR method, at least for a few years. Of course, we have to solve the MRV issue all the way to the end. But honestly, some of the science project that we work on would love to have a field that has been spread with basalt a couple of years ago, so we can actually look at that. So we need to get started. Let's do some rock forming. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dirk. That was fantastic. Really great detail there and inspiring in terms of what you have been able to achieve with your field trials and what the sort of direction it points to for the future. And hello, Ingrid. Couple prepared questions, and then we're gonna tackle the audience questions. Everyone, please put your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll leave plenty of time at the end to handle as many of those as possible. Dirk and Ingrid, we always kind of start with asking our guests about how they got to where you are now. So in terms of your personal journey to climate, how you got interested in carbon removal, and then this idea of enhanced rock weathering. Ingrid, do you want to go first, and maybe then Dirk?
Of course.
Well, from my childhood, I was really passionate with nature. I've always loved plants, animals, and rocks. So I became a geologist. And at first, I was actually looking at volcanoes, doing study there, and then completely changed my research into using volcanic rocks to do climate change mitigation, which is the biggest problem that we have right now, obviously, we face as mankind. When I was hired by Fieldcode, so 2 years ago, they hired me and they say, okay, we want you to start an carbon CO2 removal project using olivine as a natural rock. And that's sort of where it all started for me.
Very cool. Dirk, you talked about your professional background, but how did you, very successful entrepreneur. Can you talk about how you moved from that realm to a different kind of entrepreneurial activity?
So 25 years ago, I started a software company, and that went well, but we found out that I may be a good startup CEO, but I'm a miserable manager. So I got out of that company. I'm still the chairman of the board, and I'm still involved with that. But I had to look for something else to keep me busy. And then I was looking where could an entrepreneur with some time on his hand, where could he do it good for everyone? And quite quickly you come up to the climate issue. And then I realized that on the mitigation side, the mechanics that are necessary there, they don't fit my guerrilla anarchistic way of working. You need more like a policy and big company thing to work on the mitigation thing. So I realized that there is this small section that's called carbon dioxide removal, and there are a few scientists working on it, but very few entrepreneurs. And then I thought, well, this could be maybe a place where I could add some value.
Excellent. So the presentation was fantastic, and there were a lot of sort of numbers and metrics in there. I want to recap a couple of them, and just to make, I think they're kind of good as rules of thumb. So number one, there's 1 ton of carbon removal for every 3 tons of basalt that's applied to a field. Is that correct?
Yes and no. For the basalt that we are using right now, we are. This is our estimate, but of course there are different rocks out there, and you can go to the half of that or to the double of that. Ingrid, correct me if you're the geologist here, but this is the rule of thumb that we are working with right now, and I'm pretty sure that we will learn more about that with the time also.
Ingrid, any thoughts on that?
No. Yes, exactly what Dirk is saying. So I think that if you would have the mineral olivine is actually the main active ingredient that's combining with the CO2 and water, and that's taking the CO2 from the air. So if you have rocks that have a lot of olivine in them, you might maybe go up in the best circumstances to almost 1 ton of CO2 removed to 1 ton of rock, but you don't have this olivine rock everywhere. Also, you cannot always apply it everywhere. So in some cases, like in Germany, you have this really great basalt, and it has less olivine, a lot of other advantages. But in that case, yes, it's going to be about 30%. So as you say, more or less for 3 tons that you add to the soil, you're going to have over the lifespan eventually. So the timing is also depending on the circumstances. You will have 1 ton of CO2 removed.
And so the 3x is kind of a conservative estimate, but it could be better.
Yes, it depends on which rocks you're using, yeah, and on the environment also, yeah.
And you said it happens over 5 to 30 years.
That's also an estimate for the moment. I mean, like there are many estimates. They're based on things that results of experiments that we've done in the labs, experiments that people have done all over the world in the field, in pots. So we're gonna be able to narrow that down much more specific. But let's say that 5 years would be quite optimistic right now. 30 years seems to be a very good estimate, and maybe in some circumstances, depending on the soil, the climate, the vegetation, it might even be longer than that. But I think it's a good time frame for the moment to work with.
Yeah, and so variables.
I also think there's one mathematic thing there. So the process is like going like this. It has a very long tail.
Okay.
So actually, the end of the tail is probably 200 years in the future, but that's not what we are talking about here. So most of the 30% is being rather in the 30 years.
Yeah. And the things that can affect it are, as we talked about, the reactivity of the mineral feedstock. And then do things like temperature and humidity, will they affect the rate?
Yes, they will. Yes. So the more water, the better. This has been seen in all different types of experiments. A higher temperature is better. And then, of course, it's a chemical reaction. So water and CO2 with the right mineral dissolves the mineral and changes the CO2 into carbonate, into a new carbon form that's no longer in the atmosphere. So obviously, if you have more of the ingredients, let's say, you can make more of the product. So if you have an environment with more CO2, like in a soil where you have bacteria and roots that are producing more CO2, you can have up to 100 times or even more CO2 in the soil compared to the atmosphere. You will also make it faster. Also really important is the type of soil you have, to see if the water can easily percolate through it, and the pH. So there's a lot of variables in there that you have to take into account. Yeah,
it's great to know. It's great to be investigating all these things. And one last sort of metric, you had said you can apply 40 tons, and I'm sure this varies too, but you could apply, as a rule of thumb, you can apply 40 tons of rock dust, basalt, to a hectare, which is 2.47 acres.
Basalt, yes. Basalt, yes.
And that's annual. And can you keep doing that forever?
No, it's not annual. No, it's not annual. So we do not have a complete answer to that question, actually. I do not expect us to do that, especially in the beginning when we have a lot of fields that do not have any basalt on them. We do not expect that we do this on the same fields all over again while the next field has not been treated yet. That does not make sense. So in the beginning, we will just try to find as many new fields as we can, and then we will probably do this every 3 to 5 years. Something like that. Depends also on the speed that we are measuring. But what we want to avoid is if you put too much of basalt on a field, and if you do that every year, then you're creating some chemical effects that you don't want actually, and you're probably losing some of the carbon removal potential that you're doing. So I think for now, every few years is a good point. And as long as we haven't treated half of the country, there will still be a field that has not been treated yet at all.
But if I'm an individual carbon farmer and I have 100 hectares, we don't know how much I can apply on an annual basis or how I would have to rotate it, or those kind of open questions still.
Well, if you have 100 hectare, you would need to spread 4,000 tons. That's a big pile of rocks. Yeah. I don't think he has enough time to do that every year. But practicality is a thing here. So He will probably do it on the first 20 hectares this year, the next 20 hectares. So something like that, because you still have to practically do that. Ingrid, I'm sorry, not.
No problem. I just wanted to add that it will really depend, practicality, as you say, Dirk. It depends where is your field, what type of soil is your field, and in your neighborhood, what kind of rocks do you have? Because there are rocks with more olivine in them, but then you cannot add so much because olivine has some heavy metals in there, and there's of course concern about that. So I cannot give you a general answer. I have to look at your soil, which crops you have, which rocks you have in the neighborhood, how much we can put on them. And I think for liming, farmers sometimes do it every year in smaller amounts. So if they would do it as a replacement for liming, they might say, I do 1 or 2 tons every year, because I'm doing it for liming, I'm doing it with basalt. If it's not like this, they say, I want to have one huge amount in one time. There's also the issue that there's going to be different kinetics, different speeds of the chemical reactions. If you have one huge amount that you put, let's say, once every 10 years, or if you add a little bit every year and changing the chemistry of the environment a little bit slower. So my answer usually to all your questions is like, we don't really know yet. We have to look into many things.
One more thing about this. This is something where, for example, Lithos Carbon is doing a lot of work. They have developed a model where you can plug in some data from your field and the weather and climate and blah blah blah, and this will give you a recommendation for each field. And the trick will be to roll this out and scale it in some way. But this is something that we need. So we've created this cheat sheet to avoid the bad corners that you would actually create more CO2 in the air. That's why we created the cheat sheet. But in the long term, we need models and recommendation engines for that.
And last question from me, and I understand that it's not answerable, but would love to get your perspective on it. We're talking about MRV and enhanced rock weathering, CDR via enhanced rock weathering. It's an open system. It's not like direct air capture where you can meter CO2 that you're capturing from the air and put it, we think, very securely underground. Not really a ton of questions there. It's just the questions are cost and energy requirements and everything else. And can it be feasible techno-economically feasible at scale? We know that ERW is techno-economically feasible, we think.
You do.
Certainly with raised rock, I've definitely heard assertions that if you have to grind the rock, that could be problematic from an LCA perspective. But in terms of MRV, and given the urgency that we act, like how do we get to a place where we can have? It sounds like we're never going to have 100% certain MRV with an open system CDR method like ERW. Like how do we? What is the best? In a climate relevant time frame, what is the best approximation that you think we can hope to achieve, and like how will that work?
Let me answer with, so you've seen this rock in Iceland. That rock, all the weathering that happened there, this took 0.3 tons of CO2 out of the air for every ton of rock that was weathered there. So if you put out basalt or these rocks on the field, it will eventually pull the CO2 down. And our climate problem will go on for maybe 50 or 100 years. I don't know, maybe even longer. So from that perspective, any rock that you put out will help. The MRV question only comes up because we need to find people who pay for that. And they want to know, well, is it in my lifetime that this ton that I'm paying for is actually pulled down, or will my son enjoy the less CO2? So, and as I said, from some of the experiments that we do, and also what we see from other enhanced rock weathering companies and scientists, it is faster than the 30 years for most of the effect. And the rest we will know in a year or two, maybe 3 years, I don't know. But we are very close to get there.
So we're working on it.
Yes.
I'm just trying to get my mind around what a vision of like an initial minimum viable product, if you will, to use a software term of ERW MRV might look like.
That's what you're trying to do with our end-to-end demo project this fall. So we are actually buying the basalt from the basalt company, and we do everything until we have a certificate. We sell that on Carbon Future. So the whole value chain is being tested. And from the calculations that we are seeing right now, we will be able to at least be that nobody along the value chain will actually put money into it on top of that.
Got it. Cool. Mega, do you want to hop on and start asking some audience questions? And thank you guys for bearing with me on this.
You're welcome.
Yeah, sure. So I think we got a couple of questions on the sort of grinding size of the particles. And I know it's mentioned in that sheet that you sent a link to, Ingrid, but I guess there's a combination of considerations in there that seem to cover like the sort of cost and energy of grinding to smaller versus the benefits in terms of the surface area to volume ratio. So could you just talk a little bit more about how those considerations balance out? And also a bit about how you kind of arrived at the sort of calculations you have around different particle sizes.
Ingrid, you, me, I don't know.
Okay. When it comes about the calculations for the MRV and the practical things of scaling it up, it's you, please.
So there are some studies out there that you can look at where they did rough calculations on how much energy you need to grind down stuff. And as I've told you, our experiments mostly run on the coarser stuff right now, which does not need as much milling. There are huge piles of waste basalts in these mines, and this is a waste product from creating other basalt products. And so this is already existing. There's no additional energy needed to use that stuff. So if we take most or a lot of these waste basalts, we will actually, so the basalt company maybe even make some money out of it, because they're storing the stuff is also costly. And on the other hand, we did not. We are using some stuff that's already there, and so the energy balance there is not related to the size of the grains.
Okay, got it. Yeah, I guess kind of related, someone asked if there's a reason why you do it as a dry powder, and if there's a way you could spray it as an aqueous mix. I assume that would require more grinding down, but yeah.
Imagine you're driving over 1 hectare with a trailer and you're spreading 40 tons of rock. And now you're adding water to that, and you also have to drive across the field all the time. The compacting of the soil is a problem. And so if we are even adding more water, then we'll do even more compacting. From what we have looked at, I don't think it's a good idea.
Yeah, okay, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, we had some questions about what happens, after the carbon dioxide is captured. How do you kind of keep track of what happens with the bicarbonate ions, where they flow to, and how can you be sure about the fact that carbon dioxide doesn't get released from that down the line?
That's your thing.
Yeah. I was just going to answer that in the chat. Actually, I was trying to answer some questions in the chat.
Okay.
Great. I just said that's a really great question, a really good point. So yes. So the CO2 changed into carbonates. It's not a one-way reaction. It can be reversed. It can go back again. It depends on, again, the chemistry of the soil, where it is. If the chemistry of the soil is correct or is good for this, has a lot of calcium, maybe the carbonate will be forming a calcite crystal straight away, and then it's locked forever. Maybe it goes into a river, and then there the chemistry changes and it's released again, or eventually it goes into the ocean. So short answer, we cannot know for sure if this CO2 taken from the air turned into a carbonate will be a carbonate ion forever and get locked down in a mineral. There's a small chance that it might be released again. However, we are not only releasing the carbonates, we're also releasing cations. And cations, if they eventually get taken up by the plants, but if the cations eventually reach the ocean, they're increasing the alkalinity. And there's a chemical process that with increased ocean alkalinity, again, more CO2 will be taken up. So short answer is we cannot know for sure, but on the long run, there's more than one way that actually weathering of rocks will draw down CO2, directly or indirectly. I hope that answered the question.
Wonderful.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And then, yeah, just in terms of what happens with the actual basalt, as you said, it takes, I think you said 5 to 30 years to actually sort of complete the reaction. Does it need to be sort of in contact with the air to work, or what happens if there's tilling or there's runoff from rains and the basalt, moves around over that period of time?
So I would say that it doesn't have to be in contact like with the air, because you have air pockets in the soil, and you have the bacteria that are releasing CO2, you have the plants, roots that are releasing CO2. The thing is that if you would do tilling, in general, tilling and plowing land is bad for the CO2 you can have in the soil, because you're disrupting all the processes. So in principle, if you have a grassland or a forestry, there the soil is more mature, it's intact, you have all the systems of the roots and the biology, so it can keep more CO2. So tilling is not going to be better because you get more air to it, because actually you're releasing some of the CO2. So counteractively, it's better to not till if possible, to have more of the CO2 in there. And then what was the other part of this question? Can't remember it now.
Yeah, go ahead.
The water. In general, there's no problem. I think the more water, the happier the basalt is. Yeah.
Got it. Okay, fair enough. Right. Then we got a couple of questions, I guess, just more about the application of doing this on farms. So someone asked if you would do this on forestry lands or, things outside of farmlands, and what are the considerations around potentially doing that?
So we've been trying this on mostly on croplands like right. Maize or wheat. We've been also, if you looked at the pictures, we've been doing it on grassland also. I think forests are a little tricky. How do you drive through a forest with a spreader that can carry 10 tons of basalt? That's a little tricky. So we haven't looked at that. Maybe you need some small robots running around and spreading the stuff like the vacuum cleaner. So we have not looked at the other options, but I think if we just take the land that has been driven over by the farmers for fertilizer and for manure and stuff like that, if we just use that and just add one working step for them, I think it's the easiest way to get to speed, because these fields they are accessible by large machinery. The farmers already have large machinery and stuff. So there are many practical things that point to croplands as the point where we can scale faster in the beginning.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And then also just thinking about, the farming applications, someone asked if biochar is another solution that potentially, just asking how that would interact. So if you, would you spread them in the same areas?
There's one interesting thing with biochar. Biochar, if you put biochar on a field, then it will lose some of the carbon over time. So after 50 or 100 years, there's less carbon in the field. And with enhanced weathering, we are doing the exact different thing. So it's going up. So if you add both together, you will actually create a carbon sink that's permanent, because in the beginning you put you have put 1 ton of 1 CDR ton of biochar in the field, and the respective amount of basalt, and over the next 100 years there will be just this 1 ton of basalt of carbon stored in that field. So it's something that you can add on top of it. We also have some trials, made some trials to see if there is a connection between the two, if they help each other. I don't remember that there was a big effect yet. But of course, this is something that you can also look at.
Okay, yeah, super interesting. And then I'm just going to ask one last one before I give this back to Toby to close us out. Are there any proposed methodologies out there for enhanced weathering to be accepted in any of the regulated markets? And what kind of regulations around this are you hoping to see to help these kinds of projects move forward?
Yeah, well, I think the next step would be to be accepted in the voluntary carbon market first. And I think one guy from the EU said on the Climeworks conference that He is not intending to combine the regulated markets with the current with the current markets over the next 10 years. So I think we are on our own right now.
Okay, great. Thank you guys so much. That was amazing and super interesting for all of us, I think. Toby, I'll just give it back to you to finish us up. Thanks, guys.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mega. And thank you to the audience for, first of all, being with us and for all the great questions. Sorry we couldn't get to them all, but I think thank you for Ingrid, handled a few of those in the Q&A box. And Ingrid and Dirk, thank you so much for being with us. That was super interesting. And MRV is such a hot topic in CDR right now. It was really great to be able to think about some of these thorny issues in the context of enhanced rock weathering, which is many of our favorite CDR method. With lots of potential and super exciting. And thank you for all your work and again for being with us. Going to close out with a few programming notes from OpenAir. One of the things we're working on this summer is a citizen lobbying push for the federal CDRLA, which is a CDR procurement bill at the federal level. There are versions in the House and the Senate. It's a great bill. It will be super impactful. And our membership is basically mobilizing to contact our local our local congressional representatives in both the House and the Senate to ask them to support the bill. And it's been super effective so far. And so would love to have you be a part of that. Again, there should be a link in the chat to join OpenAir, and we can quickly plug you in with a team that can provide you with the materials so that you can contact your local representative. So that's one of the things we're working on. In terms of This Is CDR, we have another great European CDR initiative next week, a direct air capture company from the Netherlands called Carbdown. They were an X Prize milestone awardee, and they're a super exciting and fairly novel method of direct air capture. On the 16th, we have another very novel CDR method, a company called Inner Earth based in Australia, and they are doing a very specific kind of biomass burial, which you've already covered in the past on This Is CDR, that is very interesting and native to the Australian outback. So it'll be very cool to hear from them, our first Australian presenter, and they will be presenting in the middle of the night their time, which we'll be very grateful for. On the 23rd, we're back to Europe with Carbofex, which is a Finnish biochar company, and they have existing plants that are producing biochar and renewable energy at scale. That will be a great one as well. And then we have a bunch of others we'll be announcing shortly. Coming up in September, we have Travertine, which is a really interesting new company, recent strike purchase, that is generating hydrogen sulfate from mine tailings. That is an industrial chemical, and also that method will remove CO2 from the atmosphere. We're working on a program on ocean MRV to kind of be a companion for this one, and we've got a bunch of other things to announce. So please stay tuned. There should be a link in the chat to follow us on Twitter, where you can kind of keep track of what's going on with OpenAir, both from a policy perspective and from a programming perspective. Again, next week we have Carbdown, a Dutch DAC company, which we're excited about. And thank you all for being with us. And thank you again to Dirk and to Ingrid for such an interesting presentation and for all your work on enhanced rock weathering. Everyone be well, and we'll see you next week.